This video is brought to you by Patreon provider Kyle.
Pew, 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 pew. 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 Psst. Pew. Pew, pew. Pew, pew.
No Half-Life sound effects in this video. I apologize. Instead, I'm going to get right into something that's absolutely fascinating. On this $300 some odd Chinese-made LPVO, the Eyebox and the image do not really shift all that much at maximum magnification here at 6x. The image does not degrade. You get very little scope body, and it's a beautiful looking image. There, I said it. But to give you an idea of how sometimes you don't always get what you pay for, here is the Sig Tango6T in first focal plane that, if you didn't watch my review on it, go watch it. But the reason why I had to show so much of the scope body was because if you moved it from the sweet spot even the slightest, the image just fell apart. So to get it as clear of an image as possible, we saw a lot of the scope body, and that's just the way it was. But this $300 Chinese-made optic performs better than that.
Primary arms 1 to 6 first focal plane. I can't really do a box test. The vertical is slightly canted counterclockwise. It's as good as I'm going to get it. Let's see if it has any abnormalities. I think that's more than enough. I can't really see if these are returning to 0, but at least it looks like it's not shifting too much. Beautiful. Looks pretty good. Perfectly fine.
You know when you just mess up? Well, I messed up. I did not film my reticle overview section where I talk about the reticle. Fortunately, there's not really much to talk about it, other than it's the ACSS Raptor reticle. This is a first focal plane LPVO, so that's about it. You can see there is distortion at the far extremes on this thing, but the centermost image is very good as far as it being flat. Image, despite the fact there's some distortion in the edge, is still fairly sharp. As far as the reticle goes, just to get this out of the way, I wish manufacturers would do more than just have especially a first focal plane reticle like this in the middle. Illumination is adequate for at least making contrast in dark targets. What I mean about the reticle though is, why not have a half a duplex on there, so this way it helps draw your eye to the center, or even like big German number 4 posts at 3, 6, and 9 o'clock to help say, hey, look, this is where the center is, as opposed to getting behind it and figuring out, all right, where's the middle of it? The illumination is not bright enough to pull your eye to it, and the reticle is kind of small at 1x, so you can get lost in it very easily, and that's a no-no. But despite that, I kind of like the reticle. I love the chevron, I like the drops, and I like the wind holds. As far as the overall circle around it, it could be worse, it could be better. How could it be better? Maybe a little bit thinner, but then you'd lose it even quicker. So as a whole, I would think it would need to be revamped a little bit. So that's basically it for the reticle and the illumination. It does its job well enough if all you're worried about is making contrast with dark targets. Because, hey, you could pick up that it's red here on a very bright sunny day. That's better than some other LPVOs we've looked at. As far as the image quality, this thing is vastly superior to most other first focal plane LPVOs, especially in the 1 to 6 category. Yeah, it's a Chinese-made optic. They're about $400 at full cost, but you can find these for low to mid 300s easily. I don't know if they'd go down as far as, the $200 range, but even if they stay in the low to mid 300s, for at least the image quality on this thing, it's fucking impressive. I mean, just look at how good that looks between 30 and 800 yards. Everything is fairly well in focused. It's sharp, it's clear. The reticle isn't also the sharpest. It's got a bit of a jagged edge to it if you really pay attention to it. But for a 1 to 6, that's okay. The 1 to 8 is definitely more noticeable, which we will talk about on the full review of that, as well as the comparison between the two. But another thing this does great is it's fairly forgiving at 6x. Yeah, you can be slightly off axis as you see, and it's all right. As far as light transmission in late evening, this is 7 o'clock, late part of the spring. The sun's gone down. A little bit hard to see in some of those shadowy areas. But again, we have a decent looking image. As far as the overall brightness of the illumination, it looks great. More than sufficient for darker environments. As you saw earlier in the garage clearing, that was more than bright enough. Any brighter than that, it might start to wash out. You might not see your target. You might not be able to see your target. Whereas here, it's more than sufficient. As far as how does this compare to other first focal plane LPVOs, well, I'll be putting some more footage of that towards the end. But for right now, let's just admire how this image looks. So despite the fact that it's dark, we still have plenty of resolution on most of those things on that roof. The brick building, the door, the windows, the parapet wall. I didn't mention it earlier, but there's very little chromatic aberration, and the illumination here is more than sufficient. The exit pupil does become a little bit less forgiving here with a lot less light coming through it, but again, that's something that you're going to see across the entire board. And in fact, with all first focal plane 1 to 6s, I haven't really been impressed with any of that. At least the illumination stays on if you're slightly off axis, as opposed to the Leupold Mk6, which was instantaneously off. Moving to my home away from home, the 50-yard line at my local range, and you'll see that everything lines up behind it very well. There's very little shift to the image. Typically, we might see a little bit of shift to a massive amount of shift on the black berm behind the targets, but here it's fairly lined up. If you pay closer attention to the rocks above it or at the very far extremes through the image, you will see that the image does pull. It is noticeable, but it's not as noticeable as some other imperfections like having fisheye dead center. Like I said, the center around the reticle is pretty flat on this, but at the very extreme edges, it does pull a little bit. Illumination, yeah, it's not perfectly daytime bright, but the reticle is also not impossibly small, albeit it's not an ideal size for what I would be using this for. But you know what? Again, it's not the worst, but it's not the best. And then just keep in mind the price. This is less than $400. Judging from what we already saw, the image at 50 yards is fantastic. There isn't much to really say. It performs extremely good. Another area where this thing performs very well is the Eyebox. The 1X is stupid forgiving. It's as good as most second focal plane LPVOs, and that's fantastic. A lot of the first focal plane stuff I've been getting has been a disappointment in one way or the other. With this, the only disappointment that I have is maybe the reticle's a little bit too small. I wish they would just do, like I said, some German number 4 posts at 3, 6, and 9 o'clock to help you draw it towards the center. But other than that, this thing performs flawlessly. At 4X here, it's it's at least average in its performance. And at 6X, the exact same thing. It's at least average, which is all I could ever expect from an LPVO at any price point, let alone something so cheap. Now, yes, you guys are going to be like, oh, but I don't want to buy Chinese-made stuff. There are plenty of other options out there, but you're going to be sacrificing some other stuff. Look at the Sig Tango6T. the first focal plane version of that, you see so much of the scope body. The illumination's just average, but the reticle gets so fucking small at 1x, you can't see the damn thing. And you see so much of the scope body, and the image is flawed from basically edge to edge. It's horrible compared to this thing. But again, more on that very soon. Getting behind this thing under live fire practice is actually pretty easy despite its slight shortcomings with the size of the reticle. The Eyebox, like you saw, is very forgiving. You have a very good looking image. It lets through plenty of light, and the illumination is just enough to create contrast. So speed drills at 50 yards on small targets, absolutely no problem. Out here at 100 yards, calling your shots, no problem. 200 yards into the dirt, no problem. 300 yards into the dirt. It gets a little tricky, but you know what? As you'll soon see, at 300 yards, this thing still looks really, really good. Target in the foreground is about 50 yards. Targets behind that a little bit over 100. The sun was right behind us, giving us this sort of weird light. But you still see the illumination, and the targets look fantastic. So do the woods behind that. You can see a lot of contrast in that just muddled mess of dead branches. I really wish that manufacturers would, at least in this regard especially, illuminate just the chevron. I don't know why they don't. Make it as bright as you can, and just on the chevron. I don't get it. I'm sure it has something to do with when you back it out to 1x, it just becomes so small. No matter how bright it is, you won't be able to see it as much. So who knows? Maybe that's the case. I take some pop shots with the 22 LR at 200 yards into the dirt purposely so you could see that you can call your shots at 200 yards from a 22 LR with this thing. That is pretty damn impressive. Like I said, the image quality on this thing is exceptional for what it is. And what it is a Chinese-made cheap LPVO. It has no right being this nice. And you know what? If you're on the fence about, hey, I want to try out a first focal plane 1:6 and I don't want to break the bank, this is probably be what I would recommend because it's so cheap and it works extremely well as a 1:6 first focal plane. This is how most other 1:6 LPVOs should function. Now, none of you have seen the 8X version of this yet, or at least in full. So here it is side by side. 8X is on the right. And the 6X clearly has a slightly better image, but slightly better colors here at 6X as opposed to 8X. And just a little bit better contrast. I think the 6X just performs a little bit better overall. So the illumination on the 8X might be a little bit brighter. But what about other first focal plane LPVOs? Our next quick comparison is of the Credo first focal plane 1:6. In my opinion, the PrimaryArms has a better image. It's got better colors. Granted, completely different times of the year when I film these, but you get a sense for what you could expect through this thing. And here's an interesting tidbit. Of these soon-to-be comparisons I'm going to show you, the PrimaryArms has the largest field of view at 19.8 feet at 100 yards. Trijicon claims the Credo here only has 18.8 foot at 100 yards. So that's a difference. It's a difference. And say what you want, but this $400 optic on the left looks a lot better than the $1,000-some-odd optic on the right. Granted, the Credo feels significantly better in hand and to use, but optically speaking, this PrimaryArms is vastly superior. If you think that's crazy, let's step it up even further to an optic that costs basically 4 times the price of the PrimaryArms, the Leupold Mk6 1:6 here in first focal plane. Granted, the Leupold does have significantly brighter illumination, but just look at the image. It's not too far off from one another, which is it's absurd. Not only that, the field of view on the Mk6 is claimed at 19.3 feet, so you get a half a foot less than you do with the PrimaryArms, and you could see it. I mean, granted, I don't have the same point of zero, but just look at how much more to the left you can see on the PrimaryArms. It's absurd. It's absurd. It's absurd how good this thing looks for the price. They say seeing is believing, but unfortunately, whenever you're going to buy an optic or anything for that matter, it's not just how it looks. And of course, the Leupold trounces it as far as how well it's built and how it feels and how it works outside of it just looking fantastic. Our last quick comparison is going to be of that of the Tango6T in first focal plane. I was very disappointed with this particular optic because the second focal plane version is so good. But I guess the same could be exactly said for the Credo line, because the Credo first focal plane sucks by comparison to the second focal plane HX. I know they have a standard Credo second focal plane non-HX, but apparently Trijicon claims it's the exact same glass. It's only a difference in reticle. Who knows? But I don't think the illumination is going to be quite as extreme as it is on the HX, given it has a segmented circle on the non-HX models. Anyway, can you really compare these two? No, because the PrimaryArms looks significantly better. Granted, we do have a lot more miraging going on with the Sig. It was a lot colder day than when I filmed this PrimaryArms, but regardless to that fact, the colors pop a lot better with the PrimaryArms. You see even more field of view. If, in case you're wondering, the Sig claims it's only got 17.7 feet at 100 yards. So you're getting over 2 feet more of field of view with the PrimaryArms, and that's a lot. And at 1X, it's even more. But strictly keeping it scientific here to give you guys a better idea of what to expect. Granted, the illumination is going to be better on any of these optics. Well, actually, no, with the exception of the Credo. The Credo green was piss poor. Probably worse than the PrimaryArms, I would actually have to say. But there you go. Quick comparison between a couple of... Can you even say that they're comparable optics? I can't, because the Credo of the three competitors is probably the cheapest, and it's still more than twice the price of this. So many of you might be saying, is this the best first focal plane LPVO I've got my hands on? Or at least in 1:6 form. And you know what? It's surprisingly really good. Yes, it is a Chinese optic. Yes, it's extremely inexpensive. Would I trust my life to this? No. And that's going to be the kicker. Because no matter what, you're getting a Chinese-made optic at a very budget price. And as a result, the rest of this thing feels pretty friggin' cheap. Now, here's the thing. If you're curious about getting a first focal plane 1:6 and you don't want to spend a lot of money and you don't know what you're going to put it on and you're not going to trust your life to it and you just want to have it on a range gun or even a 22 for that matter, just to get a feel for if you even like the idea or the concept of one, this would be the one to get. Because it doesn't break the bank. Image quality is vastly superior to most of the competition that this thing fights, that goes up against, and it's unbelievable in that regard. Illumination's acceptable even in daytime, just to create contrast against a dark target. The reticle could be a little bit better improved, I know, but the overall feel and finish on this thing is just really, really cheap, and that's its biggest letdown. If this thing was in the GLX platform and it was made in Japan and it cost $1,000, I think it would probably be worth it, because PrimaryArms is known to have a really good warranty, and at that point, what does it really matter? Anyway, that's going to be all for this review. Kyle, thank you so much for sending this in. I think Kyle's actually going to be running this on his gun for the 2022 Woodlands Brutality match in West Virginia. I guess time will tell to see if it holds up or not. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching, and as always, see you again next time. And a very huge thank you to all of my Patreon providers. Without you, this wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to help support the channel but don't want to join my Patreon, I completely understand. But you can still help support by using my affiliate links in the description below. Thanks again for watching.